Blood dripped from broken lips, chains scraped across stone, and in the roar of a crowd drunk on cruelty, a child's scream split the sky. Not the cry of an infant, not the sound of a life beginning, but the wail of torment of a god-son raised in hell. This was how Angron was known, the Primarch who was born screaming. What happens when the son of the Emperor is not raised by honor nor by destiny, but by whips, collars, and the jeers of masters who saw him as less than an animal? What happens when divinity is bound in iron? The answer is written in Angron's story, etched in blood, madness, and sorrow. His is not the tale of triumph, but of tragedy, a myth where freedom is always a mirage, and chains are never broken. Picture it. The heat of the arena rising like the breath of some buried god, sand soaked in gore, churned into a pace beneath thousands of feet. At its center, Angron, massive, towering, drenched in blood, not all his own. His chest heaves, his eyes blaze, and around his neck, iron links drag, pulling him backward with every movement, biting into flesh already scarred by 1,000 lashings. The mob howls. They love him not as a man, not as a warrior, but as a beast. Their beast. This was his life, from the beginning. But to understand end, we must first walk back to the snow, back to the night his life began not in glory, but in chains. He fell to the world of Nuceria like a comet from heaven, not into halls of kings, nor into temples or shrines, but into wilderness, into frozen wastes where men hunted each other for sport. His landing capsule cracked open upon the mountains, its hull steaming as the cold bit at metal and flesh. A child lay within, Angron, the son of the Emperor, designed to be a leader, a general, a savior. But Nuceria had no need of saviors. The hunters came first, men clad in armor of bone and steel, their faces cruel beneath helms decorated with the sigils of the High Riders. They saw the child not as a miracle, but as prey. His first breath of life was taken with a blade pointed at him. His first cry was not in a cradle, but in the snow, as spears thrust to test his flesh, to see if this thing could bleed. It did. He fought even then, lashing out with a fury no infant should know, striking, clawing, resisting. But he was overwhelmed, chained, dragged like an animal from the wreck of his capsule, and presented before masters who would make him theirs. He was not raised as a child. He was forged as a tool. The High Riders ruled Nuceria through fear and spectacle. They were tyrants who fed their slaves into the arenas, where bloodshed was both punishment and celebration. And when they looked upon Angron, they did not see a child worthy of nurture. They saw a prophet, a body that healed from wounds which should have killed, muscles that grew faster, stronger, harder than any mortal, a voice that roared louder than their engines of war. He was a prized beast of their pit. And so the son of the Emperor was given no kindness, no guidance, no love, only chains and the endless demand to fight. Years passed, though to Angron they were not years at all, but the rhythm of battle, the cycle of pain. Dawn brought the lash, noon brought the arena, night brought the cold embrace of chains biting into flesh. He learned the way a man learns to breathe, through survival, to parry not because of skill, but because to fail was to be torn apart for the amusement of those above, to kill, not out of hatred, but because mercy was not permitted unless it was twisted into spectacle. Every moment of his life was bent to the will of those who ruled from the high balconies. They dined on delicacies as the blood of slaves slicked the sand beneath them, raising goblets in laughter as men screamed their last below. But here lies the cruelest truth. Even then, even as a child drenched in suffering, Angron's heart was not entirely lost. He showed mercy when he could, and in the pain of comrades too wounded to stand. He fought not always for crowd, but for those beside him, seeking to shield them even as he was dragged back into the slaughter. Beneath the scars, beneath the rage, there flickered humanity. The tragedy was that Nuceria did not want his humanity. It wanted his rage. It wanted his screams. It wanted his blood. He grew in stature, his frame swelling with the unnatural strength of a Primarch. but his soul bore the fractures of endless cruelty. The crowd named him many things: monster, beast, gladiator, but the name that clung to him most was whispered with awe and terror alike: the Eater of Cities. He had not yet conquered a city, not yet led armies, but the promise of destruction radiated from him. The High Riders paraded him as their jewel, their weapon, their spectacle, a living engine of violence. Yet to Angron, every cheer was a chain tightening around his throat. Every victory was another reminder of captivity. And so he was born in chains, not into the light of destiny, but into the shadow of oppression. From the very first scream, his life was tragedy written in blood. He was the Emperor's son, yet he never knew his father's hand. He was meant to be a liberator, yet he was forged as a slave. He was born to lead armies, but he first learned to kill for the amusement of tyrants. In this, Angron's fate was sealed long before the Horus Heresy, long before demonhood, long before the galaxy trembled at his name. For when a godson is raised in chains, those chains never truly break. They only sink deeper until they are part of the soul itself. The capsule split open like a wound in the mountainside, steam rising into the bitter air. Metal hissed against ice, and inside lay a child who should have been cradled by destiny, but instead was abandoned to the cruelty of chance. This was Nuceria, a world where the strong lived like gods and the weak lived only to die for their amusement. And so the Emperor's lost son, Angron, was not discovered by brothers or sages, but by hunters. Their armor was crude yet proud, bone and iron fused into savage forms, their banners painted with the sigils of the High Riders who rule from above the clouds. When they looked into the capsule and saw the child, red-haired, fierce-eyed, already thrashing against the cold, they did not kneel. They did not marvel. They laughed. The hunters tested him with spears, poking the infant's flesh as one might test a hound or a wolf cub. The child roared in defiance, and his roar was louder than any child should be. He clawed at them, struck at them, bit and tore, spilling blood even before he could walk. But he was bound, beaten, chained, and dragged down the slopes. The snow drank his blood, and the mountains echoed with his cries. The son of the Emperor, born to inspire legions, began his life as prey. Nuceria was a world of duality. Below, fields and slave warrens where mortals toiled and suffered. Above, citadels suspended in poisonous clouds, where the High Riders feasted and judged who would live or die. Angron was carried upward into those citadels, not as a child to be nurtured, but as a prize to be displayed. There was no cradle waiting for him, only the dark stone of a gladiatorial pit. No lullabies, only the crack of the lash. His first meal came not from gentle hands, but from bowls shoved into the sand meant for animals. He grew quickly, unnaturally quickly, as all Primarchs did. His bones hardened, his muscles swelled, and by the time he was barely past infancy, he stood as tall as grown men. And always he fought. That was a lesson drilled into him by pain. Fight or die, kill or be killed. He faced men twice his size, beasts bred for slaughter, war machines forged for the pits. And he learned not only how to survive, but how to endure humiliation, the endless laughter of the High Riders, the jeering chant of crowds who saw in him not a child, but a monster in the making. The arena became his childhood, where others learned to play, to read, to dream. Angron learned to dodge blades, to choke out breath from an enemy's throat, to carve his way through bodies to the amusement of his masters. He bore scars across his chest and arms that no child should bear. His hands became calloused not from work, but from gripping weapons slick with blood. His innocence was not lost, it was stolen. And yet, even amid the horror, there were sparks of something else. In the pits, he was not alone. Around him fought other slaves, men and women ripped from villages, forced to kill one another while their families wept in chains. Angron looked into their eyes and saw his own pain reflected. Unlike his masters, he did not treat them as expendable toys. When one faltered, he shielded them. When one lay broken on the sand, he ended their life swiftly, sparing them the cruelty of the crowd's drawn-out demands. The High Riders mocked this, called it weakness, but the other gladiators whispered of him differently. They whispered a compassion, rare as water in Nuceria's dust. As the years crawled on, Angron grew into something terrifying. His body became immense, scarred and iron-hard, a weapon shaped by suffering. He learned not only to fight, but to inspire. Slaves began to rally to him, even in the pits. They fought harder when he stood among them. They survived longer, and they bled less in vain. A child who should have been raised as a leader was raised instead as a brother to the broken. The bonds of suffering became his first and only family. Still, the chains never loosened. Each victory earned him only new battles. Each scar was another mark of his owner's pride. They paraded him through the streets as a pinnacle of their art, their most perfect gladiator. The crowds roared, showering the sands with flowers and coin, not for his triumph, but for their own entertainment. They could not see the tragedy unfolding before their eyes, that every drop of blood hardened Angron's hatred, that every cheer echoed in his skull like mockery. And yet, perhaps the cruelest part of all was this: he never knew what he had lost. Angron did not know who he truly was. He did not know he was crafted by the Emperor's hand, a Primarch destined to lead legions across the stars. He did not know brothers waited for him, scattered across the galaxy. All he knew was the pit, the whip, the chain, the scream. His childhood was not stolen in a single moment. It was strangled slowly, every day, until all that remained was the boy of the pits, the child of the snow, the gladiator who was born screaming and never stopped. Because of this, Angron was different from every other Primarch. The others were shaped by their worlds. Yes, some harsh, some brutal, but always as leaders, as kings, as figures of reverence. Angron was shaped as a slave. His world gave him no throne, no empire, no wisdom. It gave him chains, and in those chains he learned only one truth. The strong rule by cruelty, and the weak must suffer. That truth would guide him all his life, twisting him, breaking him, until even freedom itself was poison in his eyes. And so his story began not in victory, not in triumph, but in snow stained red, in chains clamped shut, in the roar of a mob that did not see him as a son of destiny. They saw only a beast to be bled. And Angron, the Primarch who was born screaming, was forced to grow into their vision, even as he longed for something else, something he could never have. The pits of Nuceria were not mere arenas. They were altars, altars of cruelty, built upon blood and bone. The High Riders believed themselves gods, and their worship was not prayers whispered to the stars, but the spectacle of slaughter. They dined above the killing grounds, goblets heavy with spiced wine, their laughter rolling across the sands like thunder, while below men and women were carved apart for their delight. For the slaves who bled upon those sands, death was not an accident. It was the purpose. And at the center of this savage theater stood Angron. He grew not as a son, not as a leader, not as the Emperor had intended, but as a weapon, honed through agony. By the time his frame had reached its prime, he was more than a man and less than a man, his body vast and unbreakable, his heart scarred, his mind bent beneath years of torment. The crowd called him many things, the Red Beast, the Savage, the Slayer. But the High Riders had a different name, whispered with greed upon their lips. They called him the Butcher's Plaything. He was their prize, their masterpiece. They had taken a child who fell from the stars and remade him into a spectacle of carnage. Every scar across his body was a mark of ownership. Every victory he won only chained him tighter. For each triumph meant another day in the pit, another cycle of killing to sate the endless hunger of a mob. There was no freedom in victory, only more blood, and the arenas were endless. Some were carved into the rock of the mountains, pits lit by firelight, where the air stank of sweat and smoke. Others were vast open coliseums, filled with tens of thousands of spectators, their cheers rising like a storm when Angron entered. He was forced to fight beasts bred for slaughter, creatures with jaws like iron traps, claws that could shear through stone. He fought men broken into killing machines, their eyes hollow from years of enslavement. He fought warbands armed with axes, swords, and crude engines of death. And he won, again and again. His Primarch's body healed from wounds that would have slain others. Blades broke against his bones. Arrows snapped against his flesh. But each time he rose, it was not triumph he felt. It was hatred, for though he lived, those beside him often did not. He learned to kill quickly, to strike mercifully. When a comrade staggered, bleeding out before the mob, Angron was the one who struck the final blow, sparing them from a slower agony. He carried their bodies in the sand when he could, roaring defiance at the guards who tried to drag them away like refuse. The crowd cheered, thinking it was rage. They never understood. It was mercy. It was grief. Beneath the chains, beneath the scars, beneath the blood, Angron's humanity still flickered. But mercy was a dangerous thing. The High Riders hated it. They wanted spectacle. They wanted screams, not silence. They punished him for every act of kindness. He was lashed, starved, beaten with weapons that cracked his bones. Still he endured. Still he killed quickly, sparing his brothers and sisters from torment where he could. And in doing so, he became something far more dangerous than the riders had ever imagined. He became a symbol. The slaves began to whisper of him not as a beast, but as a leader. In the darkness of their cells, they spoke of his mercy, of his defiance. They whispered of rebellion. They whispered of freedom. But rebellion on Nuceria was always crushed. The riders had armies of slaves, endless chains of soldiers bred to die for them. They had weapons carved from technologies older than memory. And yet, Angron gave hope. Even if it was doomed, even if it was impossible, he showed them that a slave could roar against his masters, that a slave could kill those who claimed to be gods. The crowd saw only blood. The riders saw only profit. But the slaves saw something else. They saw the ember of a fire that could not be extinguished. And Angron, even if he did not yet know it, carried that fire in his heart. Still, his humanity was not invincible. Each day in the pit chipped away at it. Each scream, each death, each lash carved deeper into his soul. Rage began to fill the cracks where compassion once lingered. Hatred became the mortar holding his heart together. The riders fed the hatred, pushing him into ever more brutal contests, forcing him to kill those he had fought beside only days before. To them, this was sport. To Angron, it was torment. He carried their faces in his memory. He heard their dying cries in his dreams. And when he woke, there were chains waiting to drag him back into sand. The tragedy of Angron is not that he was broken quickly, but that he was broken slowly, piece by piece, year after year, until the boy who had fallen from the snow was gone, and in his place stood the gladiator, the butcher's plaything, a being forged by cruelty, yet still carrying inside him a flicker of something the riders could never kill. Compassion buried beneath layers of rage, a longing for freedom twisted into fury, a need for family perverted by chains. This was his childhood, not a castle, not a throne, but an arena, not love, not brotherhood, but the jeers of a mob demanding more blood. And from this crucible of torment, Angron rose as something more terrible than even his masters had intended. He was not their pet. He was not their beast. He was a storm waiting to break, a fire waiting to consume, a tragedy written across the stars. And in the years to come, when he finally tore free of their chains, when he raised his voice in rebellion, it would not be the mercy of a savior the galaxy witnessed. It would be the wrath of a child who had never known anything but pain. It began in whispers, carried on the breath of broken men and women huddled in darkness after the pits fell silent. The riders thought their slaves too shattered to dream, too cowed to scheme. But in the shadows beneath the Colosseums, where the stink of blood clung to the stones and the screams of the day still echoed in memory, a seed was growing, and its name was Angron. For years, he had fought not only with the strength of a Primarch, but with something rarer, defiance. When comrades faltered, he shielded them. When they lay dying, he ended it swiftly, denying the crowd the sadism they craved. The riders punished him, lashing him until his back was raw, starving him in chains, but they could not extinguish the strange, terrible bond he had with the other gladiators. They feared him, yes. They admired him, yes. But above all, they trusted him. And on Nuceria, trust was more dangerous than any blade. The rebellion did not begin with fanfare. It began with the smallest act of defiance. A guard dragged down by chains instead of a gladiator. A rider's hound strangled in the dark by hands too fast to see. Weapons stolen, hidden beneath stone floors, passed from hand to hand in silence. The riders thought they owned Angron. They thought he was their jewel, their pet monster. But he was sharpening himself for something else entirely. He was sharpening himself for vengeance. The day came when the rebellion could no longer be contained. It erupted like a storm. The gladiators rose together in the pits, no longer killing one another for sport, but turning their blades against their masters. The crowd screamed, not in delight but in terror, as slaves leapt into the stands, hacking apart nobles who had once looked down on them as less than animals. Fire spread. Blood sprayed across the marble of the Colosseums. For the first time in living memory, the laughter of the riders was silenced by fear. At the head of it all was Angron. He roared like a god of war, chains wrapped around his arms, wielding them like whips and flails, crushing armored men with the strength of a titan. Beside him fought those who had become more than comrades, his family, forged in suffering. They were called the Eaters of Cities, not by their own choosing, but by the terror they inspired. They tore through Nuceria's streets like a tide of fury, liberating slaves wherever they went, growing stronger with every battle. It was more than rebellion. It was retribution. The riders had ruled for centuries by fear, and now fear was turned upon them. Their slaves, once broken, now fought with the fury of those who had nothing left to lose. For every rider cut down, for every guardhouse set ablaze, the myth of Angron grew. No longer just a gladiator, he became a liberator in the eyes of the oppressed, a leader, a symbol, the only one they would follow. Yet even in triumph, tragedy stalked them. The riders were not without power. Their armies stretched across the planet, drilled in discipline, armed with ancient war gear, supported by engines of death that the slaves could not match. And though Angron's band grew with every battle, they were still hunted, still outnumbered, still chained by hunger and exhaustion. The rebellion was a fire, glorious but fleeting, burning bright before the storm that would smother it. Still, Angron refused to bend. For every comrade lost, he roared louder. For every brother or sister struck down, he carved deeper into the enemy ranks. His defiance was not strategic. It was personal. He had lived his whole life in chains, and now, even if only for a moment, he would live free. Better to burn in the storm than to live again as the rider's plaything. His followers knew this. They understood the doom that awaited them, and still they marched. Picture it. A band of gladiators, scarred and blood-soaked, marching across the snow-streaked plains of Nuceria, surrounded by legions of slaves newly freed. They carried scavenged weapons, crude banners daubed in blood. They sang no hymns but their screams of vengeance. And at their center strode Angron, his chains coiled around his arms, his eyes alight with both fury and sorrow. Every step forward was a challenge hurled at the sky itself. We will not bow. We will not break. It could not last. Deep down, perhaps Angron knew. Every city they struck, every fortress they toppled, brought the riders' armies closer. The noose tightened, but to him, that mattered less than the march itself. Freedom was not in victory. It was in defiance. It was in raising a sword and saying no. Even when the world told you resistance was death, this was the only family Angron ever truly had. The brotherhood of blood, forged not by heritage or destiny, but by chains and rebellion. They were not legions, not armies trained by the emperor's hand. They were slaves, rebels, gladiators. And to Angron, they were more precious than anything else he would ever know. And it was this, this bond, this brotherhood, that would one day shatter him more completely than any lash or chain. For when the Emperor finally came, he would not come to fight beside them. He would not honor their defiance. He would steal Angron away, ripping him from the only family he had ever loved. But that is still to come. For now, the rebellion burns. The riders tremble. And for the first time in Nuceria's long, bloody history, the slaves march with their heads held high, following the roar of a Primarch who had never been anything but a slave himself. There are many ways to break a man. Chains can hold his body. Whips can scar his flesh. Hunger can hollow him out until even hope tastes bitter. But the high riders in Nuceria were not content with chains or whips or hunger. They wanted more. They wanted not just obedience, but transformation. They wanted to take the greatest slave the pits had ever birthed, Angron, their jewel, their monster, their plaything, and make him something less than human, something they could own completely. And so they turned to their most terrible invention, the butcher's nails. They called them a gift, though no gift was ever drenched in such agony. The nails were not adornments, not symbols of pride. They were engines of torment, crude implants hammered into the skull, burrowing into the brain, coiling around the very nerves that carried thought and feeling. Their purpose was simple: to erase everything but rage. Pain became constant. Thought became agony. The only relief, the only fleeting silence, came in violence. Every heartbeat was a drum pounding with fury. Every moment, without killing, felt like drowning. This was the gift the riders chose to give Angron. He was captured after a battle fought too long, too hard. Exhaustion slowed even his mighty limbs, and when his comrades fell around him, the riders descended. Chains wrapped his arms, blades pierced his flesh, a dozen, 100, striking until even his titanic frame buckled. They dragged him back into the pits, not as a champion, but as a subject. He fought them until the last moment, teeth bared, eyes blazing, but no strength could resist what came next. They pinned him to a slab of black stone, straps cutting into his wrists and ankles. He roared, but the riders only laughed. Then came the sound, the hammer against iron, the scream of metal driven into bone. The nails were forced into his skull, their crude mechanisms tearing into his flesh, burrowing into his brain. He screamed then, not with the fury of battle, but with a torment that no warrior could resist. The sound carried through pits, through the cells, into the hearts of every slave who heard it. They wept, they trembled, for they knew what was being done. Their symbol, their hope, was being broken. When the nails settled, when the agony of insertion gave way to the eternity of their function, Angron was no longer the same. His thoughts were no longer his own. The quiet moments, the spaces where he had once found sorrow, compassion, or memory of his comrades, those were gone. In their place was static, endless and unbearable, a grinding hunger that could only be silenced by slaughter. And when there was no slaughter, when there was no blood, the nails tore at him, scraping his sanity raw, reducing him to a prisoner within his own skull. Yet even then, even beneath the nails, Angron's defiance flickered. He hated them, hated the riders for what they had done, hated the chains more fiercely than ever. The nails did not erase his pain. They deepened it. They did not kill his humanity outright. They twisted it, poisoned it, turned it against him. Every time he felt the faint stirrings of loyalty, of kinship, the nails punished him with agony. Every time he tried to remember mercy, the nails screamed until only rage remained. They made compassion unbearable. They made kindness impossible. And so slowly, relentlessly, they consumed him. The rebellion still burned, though it faltered. Angron still fought, though each battle was now a storm of frenzy, a maelstrom of violence. The gladiators who had once whispered of his mercy now whispered of his wrath. They followed him still. How could they not? He was their symbol, their leader, their storm, but they could see the change. His eyes, once fierce with sorrow, now blazed too brightly with madness. His voice, once raised in defiance, was now often drowned in screams that were not words at all. The nails had not broken his chains. They had driven them deeper, until they were buried in his very soul. The irony was perfect and cruel. Angron had always hated slavery. He had fought to free his brothers and sisters from chains. He had killed for their freedom. He had bled for it. Yet now, in his very flesh, he bore the most intimate slavery imaginable, not the lash of another's hand, but the tyranny of his own mind. His rage was no longer his choice. It was demanded, enforced, compelled. Without violence, he drowned. Without blood, he was crushed beneath waves of torment. And so Angron, the liberator, the rebel, the defiant son of the emperor, became the most enslaved of all. There are whispers that in those days, when the nails were new and their torment sharpest, he would sometimes retreat into silence, that he would kneel in the darkness of the slave warrens, clutching his head in his massive hands, shuddering as the nails tore at him from within. His comrades would gather around him, afraid to touch him, afraid to speak, and yet unwilling to leave. They saw him weep, not tears of weakness, but tears of rage. Rage at himself, at what had been done to him, at the cruelty of a universe that had given him nothing but chains. The nails defined Angron from that day forward. They were his curse, his torment, his doom. He could never be rid of them. The emperor himself, for all his power, could not heal that wound, could not excise that poison without destroying what Angron had become. And so the nails screamed at his skull for the rest of his days, pushing him to acts of fury, binding him in an endless cycle of rage and regret. This was the moment his tragedy became inevitable. For until then, there had been a chance that his rebellion might have been crushed, yes, but that Angron himself might have endured, that he might have lived as more than a weapon. But once the nails were driven into his flesh, there was no turning back. His fate was sealed. He was no longer merely the butcher's plaything. He was a butcher himself, a creature of endless wrath, stripped of the choice to be anything else. And when the emperor finally came for him, he would not find a son ready to lead, ready to rise. He would find a son already broken, already enslaved, already drowning in his own blood. A son whose scream had never stopped. The rebellion was dying. Angron's brotherhood of blood, once a firestorm sweeping across Nuceria, was being ground down by the endless armies of the High Riders, the gladiators who had risen beside him bled in droves. For every rider slain, 10 more came. For every city sacked, 3 more fell upon them in retaliation. The snow-choked plains were littered with the corpses of the freed, and the pits were filled once again with slaves dragged back in chains. Yet Angron fought on, his roar echoing from mountain to mountain, the nails screaming in his skull, his wrath driving him ever forward. He could not stop. He would not stop. Not while a single comrade still lived. Not while a single rider still drew breath. And then, in the midst of that storm, the sky itself opened. The Emperor of mankind had come. Imagine the sight. The darkened heavens splitting with golden light. The arrival of a figure clad in radiance. Armies of the legions of Astartes arrayed in perfect discipline behind him. To most worlds, the Emperor's coming with salvation, the dawn of a new age. To Angron it was intrusion. He did not kneel. He did not rejoice. He bared his teeth, chains wrapped around his arms, his body broken but unbowed, his eyes blazing with hatred. The Emperor beheld his son, the Primarch he had lost to the warp's scattering, now found again on this brutal world. But what he saw was not a child to embrace. What he saw was tragedy. Angron's flesh was ruined by scars. His mind was poisoned by the nails. His heart was bound not to the dream of the Imperium, but to the brothers and sisters who fought beside him in the dust. The Emperor extended his hand. He spoke of destiny, of legions waiting for their father, of a galaxy that needed Angron's strength. But Angron did not care for destiny. He cared only for his family. The Brotherhood of Blood would not abandon their rebellion. They would die together, as they had lived together. That was freedom, not victory, not conquest, but the choice to face death on their own terms. Angron's answer to the Emperor was a roar. He would not leave. not without his brothers, not without the only people who had ever treated him as something more than a beast. And so the Emperor made his choice. With a gesture, with a flicker of power vast beyond comprehension, he tore Angron away. One moment, the Primarch stood surrounded by his family, weapons raised against the storm. The next, he was gone, stolen from their side, hurled through the immaterium into safety. Safety he had never asked for. On the mountains below, the Brotherhood of Blood fought their last without him, outnumbered, overwhelmed, butchered by the Riders' armies. Every man, every woman, every child who had marched beneath Angron's banner was cut down. Their rebellion ended in fire and chains. Angron screamed when he realized what had happened. He screamed until his throat bled, until the nails turned his grief into searing rage. The Emperor had saved his body, but he had killed his soul. For what was freedom without family? What was survival without those who had given him meaning? To Angron, it was betrayal, a theft worse than any chain. He had been robbed of his only loyalty, his only love. In that moment, the seeds of his eternal hatred were planted, not against the Riders, not against Nuceria, but against the Emperor himself. The irony was unbearable. The Emperor had come to save his son, but in doing so, he had broken him beyond repair. Angron had once been a rebel. Now he was a slave again, only this time. The chains were golden. The 12th Legion awaited him, warriors bred from his blood, eager to know their father. They knelt before him, crying out his name, welcoming him as their lord. But Angron did not see sons. He saw strangers. He saw slaves dressed in different colors. He saw chains, and in his heart, he swore he would never forgive the one who had stolen him from his true family. The Emperor had not freed him. He had only bound him tighter. This was the tragedy of Angron, that even salvation came to him as betrayal, that even the hand of God could not lift the nails from his skull, nor the grief from his soul. He had fought for freedom all his life, and when the moment came, he was denied it. He had chosen to die with his brothers, and instead he was forced to live without them. In this his fate was sealed. From this day forward, Angron would never love the Imperium. He would never trust the Emperor. He would never see the legions as family. To him, they were just another cage, gilded and vast, stretching across the stars. The chains were no longer iron, but gold, and golden chains are still chains. They called it a reunion, a triumph. Across the galaxy, the 12th Legion gathered in gleaming armor, their voices raised in battle chant, their hearts burning with anticipation. Their father had been found, their gene sire, their living god of war, would at last take his rightful place at their head. For the sons of Angron, it should have been a moment of glory. But when the Primarch stood before them, towering, scarred, and chained within himself, they saw not a savior, but a storm. The Emperor delivered him to them with pride, as if this gift would heal his wounds. But Angron looked upon the ranks of the 12th and felt nothing but hollow rage. These were not his brothers of the pits. These were not the men and women who had bled beside him in the dust of Nuceria. These were strangers bred in laboratories, soldiers drilled in discipline, warriors who bowed to him without ever having shared his chains. They called him father, but he did not see family. He saw only tools, and tools reminded him of slavery. The nails screamed in his skull. The whispers of grief returned. And in that torment, Angron made his choice. He would not be the father the Emperor intended. He would make the Legion his mirror. If he was broken, so would they be. If his skull was filled with fire, so would theirs. He would carve them into his likeness, not with love, but with the nails. One by one, he ordered the butcher's nails implanted into the warriors of the 12th. At first, they resisted. The implants were agony, destroying thought, erasing joy, leaving only fury and hunger for blood. But resistance was short-lived. Their Primarch demanded it, and his wrath was unbearable to deny. Soon, battalions of the 12th roared with the same torment that filled Angron's mind. They became killers beyond compare, berserkers who fought with such ferocity that even the Adeptus Astartes trembled at their fury. The nails bound them together, not in loyalty, but in madness. The galaxy learned to fear their name. They became the World Eaters, not simply soldiers of the Imperium, but butchers whose every battle ended in carnage. Worlds fell not through careful strategy, but through tidal waves of rage. When other legions raised banners of triumph, the World Eaters raised mountains of corpses. When others planted the sigils of conquest, the 12th left only ash and silence. To fight beside them was to walk into a storm that consumed everything, friend and foe alike. And yet, within their ranks, whispers endured. The World Eaters were not simply feared by their enemies. They were feared by their brothers. For what use is discipline when the nails scream louder than reason? What use is strategy when the only relief comes in slaughter? Other Primarchs looked upon Angron's legion with unease. They saw not warriors, but rabid hounds, unleashed only when the Emperor demanded annihilation. To Angron, this was victory. He had taken what the Emperor gave him and reshaped it in defiance. The 12th was no longer the Emperor's legion. It was his. Still, irony clung to every step. Angron had once hated slavery. He had once dreamed of freedom for the gladiators of Nuceria, but in binding his legion with the nails, he enslaved them to the same torment he endured. He chained them not with iron, but with a hunger for blood. His sons became prisoners of their own minds, incapable of peace, incapable of mercy, incapable of rest. He had given them his curse, and in doing so, he condemned them all. And yet, the World Eaters adored him. They saw his scars, his rage, his endless torment, and they did not turn away. They embraced it, because to them, it was honesty. Angron did not hide his pain. He did not pretend to be noble or wise or merciful. He was rage incarnate, and in that rage they saw truth. Where other Primarchs inspired through vision, Angron inspired through suffering. His sons knew he bled as they bled. They knew he screamed as they screamed. And so they loved him even as he damned them. Campaign after campaign, the 12th drowned the stars in blood. Their fury could not be contained. They tore through cities, armies, entire civilizations, leaving only ruin behind. When the World Eaters were unleashed, even the Adeptus Astartes struggled to stand beside them. They were unstoppable. They were unrelenting. They were damned. And at their center was Angron, the Primarch who had never known freedom, now wielding his legion as an extension of his own torment. He had been born in chains, raised in chains, betrayed in chains. And now, in a cruel irony, he had forged golden chains for his sons. They followed him without question, even as the galaxy whispered that they were less a legion and more a tide of butchers. This was the paradox of Angron's rule. He hated slavery, yet he enslaved. He sought freedom, yet he brought only torment. He longed for family, yet he could never love the family given to him. The nails screamed, and the World Eaters screamed with him. Together, they carved their legacy into the galaxy. Not in stone, not in glory, but in endless blood. And though the Emperor had thought to save him, though he had thought to give Angron purpose and meaning, the truth was clear. He had not saved his son. He had given him an army of mirrors, an army of rage, an army doomed to burn. The Great Crusade was a tide of steel and fire, driven ever onward by the will of the Emperor and the strength of his sons. Each Primarch carved his legend across the stars, some as builders, some as philosophers, others as conquerors. But Angron carved nothing but scars. Wherever the 12th Legion marched, the earth was left in ruin. Cities were not pacified, they were butchered. Armies were not defeated, they were annihilated. Even worlds that surrendered found themselves soaked in blood. Their people slaughtered because the nails in Angron's skull knew no silence but slaughter. The other Primarchs watched with unease. Guilliman, architect of order, called Angron a liability. Dorn, the eternal sentinel, called him dangerous even to his own sons. But it was Leman Russ, the Wolf King of Fenris, who would be given the Emperor's most brutal command. to confront his brother and to leash him. Russ was no stranger to rage. He was the Emperor's executioner, a beast of war clothed in wolf's hide and crowned with iron. Yet even he recoiled at what he saw when the World Eaters descended upon campaign after campaign. There was no discipline, no restraint, only madness, only frenzy, only blood. For every enemy slain, a dozen of Angron's own warriors fell, killed not by the foe, but by their own unhinged brothers, lost in the nails' endless screaming. It was war as decay, victory that tasted like ash. So it was that the Emperor commanded Russ to challenge his brother, to remind him that Primarchs were not beasts, but kings of men. And thus, upon a battlefield still steaming with blood, the wolf met the butcher. The duel was inevitable, but its clash shook more than the ground beneath them. It struck at the very heart of what it meant to be a Primarch. Angron came in like a storm, his chains whistling through the air, his axes raised high, his roar thing to freeze the marrow of mortals. He was taller, stronger, built for the pit's endless carnage. The nails howled within him, demanding blood, demanding silence. Russ, by contrast, was not frenzied. He was controlled, his fury tempered like a blade honed on the whetstone of discipline. His wolves circled, his sons held their breath, for they knew when gods clashed, even worlds could shatter. The first blows were thunder. Each strike of Angron's axes tore gouges into the earth. Each swing of Russ's blade drove sparks from iron-hard flesh. They moved with a speed that defied reason, a savagery that left the air screaming. Angron fought as he always had, with rage. Every wound he dealt was meant to kill. Every movement was a scream turned into motion. Russ fought with precision, each parry a test, each strike measured not only to wound but to teach. But Angron was beyond teaching. The nails shrieked too loudly. The longer the battle raged, the more he lost himself, his roars turning into animal sounds, his eyes glowing with madness. Russ struck him down again and again, but still he rose. Blood poured from his wounds, but still he swung. The crowd of warriors around them, World Eaters and Space Wolves alike, could only watch as their fathers tore at each other like beasts. And for a moment, Angron nearly won. He drove Russ to ground, his chains coiled around the Wolf King's arm, his axe raised high. Had he brought it down, perhaps Russ would have fallen, and history itself would have cracked upon that blow. But Russ was no stranger to fighting beasts. With a howl that shook the field, he surged up, broke the chains, and hurled Angron back with the strength of the wolf god within him. His blade pressed to his brother's throat, his fangs bared. His words thundered like judgment. You are no slave, brother. You are a Primarch. Act like one, or I will end you here. But Angron did not hear. The nails made sure of that. To him, Russ's words were chains, golden and unbearable, no different from the Emperor's theft on Nuceria. He spat blood in Russ's face and roared, not in defiance of the challenge, but in hatred of existence itself. He would never bow. He would never bend. And though Russ stayed his hand, sparing his brother at the Emperor's command, the truth was written plainly in that clash. Angron would never be tamed. The wolves withdrew, their mission failed. The World Eaters roared in triumph, but it was hollow, for their Primarch had not won anything but proof of his madness. He was stronger, yes, more savage, yes, but what is strength when it is enslaved to rage? What is freedom when it is only the silence of the nails? The duel between Angron and Russ was not victory or defeat. It was revelation. It showed the galaxy that the Primarchs were not only kings. They were beasts, chained to destinies they could neither escape nor embrace. And in Angron's case, the chains were buried too deep. Angron had been born into chains, raised in chains, and when he was stolen from the rebellion on Nuceria, he was bound in chains of gold. That was the cruelest irony of all. The Emperor had spoken of destiny, of legions awaiting their father, of a galaxy that needed Angron's strength. But to Angron, these words were hollow. He had not asked for destiny. He had asked to die with his brothers, and the Emperor had denied him even that. Every day that followed was fuel for resentment. The nails screamed in his head, demanding silence through slaughter, and the Emperor, godlike in his power, infinite in his knowledge, did nothing. The father who had forged him, who had scattered his brothers across the galaxy and reclaimed them one by one, could heal worlds with thought, could shape suns and command fleets, but he would not take the nails from Angron's skull. He offered no cure, no release, no peace. Only lectures of duty and obedience, commands to lead the 12th Legion with honor, commands to leash his rage. To Angron, it was hypocrisy incarnate. How could a being who called himself father stand idle while his son drowned in agony every waking moment? The other Primarchs found in the Emperor a source of pride, of guidance, of vision. Guilliman, Dorn, Vulcan, each saw in him a godlike figure, even if the Emperor denied divinity. But Angron saw only another tyrant. The riders of Nuceria had enslaved him with iron. The Emperor enslaved him with promises. Both demanded obedience. Both denied him choice. Both spoke of a greater purpose that required his suffering. The riders feasted while he bled. The Emperor preached while he screamed. In his eyes, there was no difference. The 12th Legion, reshaped by the nails, mirrored their father's torment. Their campaigns grew bloodier, their methods less restrained. Worlds meant for compliance were annihilated, cities reduced to ash, populations butchered in frenzies of rage. The Emperor censured Angron again and again, commanding him to restrain his sons, to discipline them, to remember the dream of unity. But what was unity to Angron when his own mind was a battlefield? What was obedience when every heartbeat was agony until it was silenced by blood? He spat on such hypocrisy. He spat on the Emperor's dream. And so, resentment deepened into hatred. Angron's thoughts returned always to Nuceria, to the brothers and sisters who had died without him. He remembered the moment of their last stand, the blades flashing in the snow, the cries of defiance, the chains rattling as the riders closed in. He should have been there. He should have died with them. But the Emperor had stolen even that final dignity. He had not saved Angron. He had only robbed him. The Emperor spoke of humanity's future, of the great Imperium stretching from star to star. But Angron remembered the slaves of Nuceria, forgotten and broken, their blood spilled for the entertainment of masters. What difference was there between the riders above the clouds and the Emperor upon his throne? Both demanded blood for their vision. Both demanded sacrifice. Angron saw the hypocrisy clearly. The Imperium was not a dream of unity. It was simply another empire of chains. This was the poisoned soil into which Horus would whisper. The War Master's rebellion would not grow in the hearts of those who loved their father. It would grow in the hearts of those who despised him. And for none was that resentment sharper than for Angron. His hatred had been forged in childhood, tempered by betrayal, sharpened by the nails. By the time Horus reached out, Angron was already broken, already lost, already waiting for someone, anyone, to tell him that his rage was not madness, but truth. The Emperor's hypocrisy was not that he lied. It was that he demanded loyalty from a son he had never given love. It was that he demanded obedience from a warrior he had enslaved. It was that he spoke of destiny to one whose only desire had been to die free. Angron could not forgive. Angron would not forgive. And so the chain between father and son, already brittle, snapped forever. The galaxy burned, and at its heart was betrayal. Horus, the War Master, once the Emperor's most trusted son, raised a banner of rebellion against his father. Brother turned against brother, legion against legion, and the stars themselves seemed to drown in fire. Among the Primarchs who chose the path of treachery, none were so inevitable, none so tragically fated as Angron. When Horus reached out to him, it was not with promises of order or dreams of empire. Horus did not speak of unity or destiny. He spoke to Angron in the only language Angron had ever known, rage. He told him that the Emperor was not a savior, but a tyrant, that the Imperium was not freedom, but slavery. that the so-called father who had torn him from his brothers on Nuceria would always betray him. And for Angron, these were not lies. These were truths he had always known in his blood. So Angron threw himself into Horus's rebellion without hesitation, not as a tactician, not as a philosopher, but as a weapon. The World Eaters roared toward his side, their nails screaming, their fury unchained. Where other legions hesitated, where some whispered doubts even in the ranks of the traitors, Angron had none. His hatred was pure. His loyalty to Horus was not love, but shared contempt for their father. If the Emperor was a tyrant, then Horus would be the hammer that struck him down, and Angron would be the blade that carved the corpse. The heresy became the perfect crucible for the World Eaters. At Isfahan, at Genna, at countless battlefields, they were unleashed as the shock troops of carnage. While other legions maneuvered, the 12 simply charged, drowning the field in blood. Their presence broke the will of enemies, not because they were invincible, but because they were unstoppable. An army that does not fear death, that seeks only slaughter, cannot be reasoned with. It can only consume. Even among the traitors, they were feared. The sons of Horus, the word-bearers, even the Death Guard, all whisper the World Eaters' madness. Allies became casualties as often as foes. When Angron led the charge, he did not distinguish friend from enemy. He only fed the nails, only sought silence and slaughter. His warriors followed without hesitation, for they were damned as he was damned. Their loyalty was not to Horus, not even to Angron himself, but to the nails screaming in their skulls. On Isfahan III, when Horus purged the loyal remnants of his legions, Angron's fury was unleashed with such savagery that the massacre became legend. Whole cities were reduced to ash. Whole populations butchered not for rebellion, but simply because their deaths fed the silence in his head. At Isfahan V, when the greatest betrayal of the heresy unfolded and half the legions turned their blades against their brothers, Angron stood at the front lines, his axes drenched, his roar thundering across the plain. There was no hesitation, no doubt, no pause. The heresy was truth to him. For the first time in his life, he was not fighting against his masters. He was fighting with his rage. And yet, there was tragedy even in this. For Horus, cunning and cold, used Angron as one uses a weapon. He pointed him at enemies and let him burn himself out in blood. He gave him no counsel, no healing, no hope, just battles, endless battles. Angron did not care. He was blind to manipulation, blind to strategy. He had never been anything but a slave to chains, and now his chains simply led him into deeper fire. The heresy revealed the truth that had always been whispered about Angron. He was never meant to be a general. He was not a builder of empires, nor a commander of fleets. He was a destroyer, pure and simple. His legions suffered for it. They bled more than any other. Their numbers dwindled as they hurled themselves into battle again and again. But to Angron, this was not failure. It was freedom. Every drop of blood spilled was defiance hurled at the Emperor. Every corpse was vengeance for Nuceria. And so the War Master's rebellion gained its most terrifying weapon. Not because Angron was cunning, but because he was inevitable. He had always been broken, always been betrayed, always been bound. The heresy did not corrupt him. It simply gave him permission. Permission to hate without restraint. Permission to kill without hypocrisy. Permission to be what the Emperor had made him into, but would never admit: a monster. When the traitor legions marched upon Terra, Angron was there. His roar shook the walls of the Imperial Palace. His axes dripped with the blood of loyalists. And still, the nails screamed in his skull, demanding more, always more. The heresy was a war of gods and monsters, but none embodied that descent into ruin so completely as Angron. The longer the rebellion raged, the more his torment grew. The nails screamed without end, driving him to fury even in moments of stillness. His legion, once a fighting force of tens of thousands, had become a rabid tide. Their numbers willed by their own madness as much as by the guns of their enemies. They no longer built, no longer conquered in any lasting sense. They only destroyed. And Angron led them deeper into the abyss. It was on Nuceria, the world of his birth, that the breaking point came. By then, Angron had marched across the galaxy, leaving oceans of blood in his wake. But to return the place of his first chains was to rip open the oldest wound. Nuceria had not forgotten him. The riders were gone, but their world still bore the scars of the rebellion. And the people still remembered the legend of the Red Gladiator. When Angron returned, it was not as a savior. It was as a god of slaughter. And they trembled. The Imperium tried to stop him. Loyalist forces clashed against the World Eaters, but Angron's fury was too great. The nails were reaching their crescendo, tearing his mind apart with every heartbeat. His body shook with seizures of rage. His roar split the sky, and yet he fought on, carving through entire armies with a madness that was no longer mortal. The more he killed, the more the nails quieted, the more blood that spilled, the clearer his thoughts became. And in that endless tide of slaughter, something ancient and watching took notice. Khorne, the blood god, the lord of skulls, he who cares not from where the blood flows, only that it flows. For years, Angron's life had been a hymn to that dark god, even if unintentional. Every scream, every massacre, every drop of blood shed in rage had been an offering. Now, upon Nuceria, the hymn reached its crescendo. The ground quaked beneath the weight of slaughter. The skies wept fire. And in that moment, Angron was no longer merely a Primarch. He was chosen. The ascension was not gentle. It was not a reward, but a transformation of torment into eternity. His flesh tore, reshaped into a monstrous form of brass and blood. Wings erupted from his back, great crimson pinions that blotted out the sun. His body swelled, armored in plates of living brass. Veins glowed with the fire of endless rage. His eyes burned like furnaces, and his roar was no longer just sound. It was the will of Khorne given voice. Where once stood Angron, Primarch of the 12th, there now towered a demon prince of the blood god. In that moment, the torment of the nails was silenced forever, not because the agony ended, but because it was swallowed whole by something greater. Angron's rage was no longer the curse of crude implants. It was the essence of his being. He was fury incarnate. His chains finally shattered, only to be replaced by shackles far darker. For though he was freed from the torment of the nails, he was now bound eternally to Khorne. His will was no longer his own. His freedom was no freedom at all. The World Eaters howled in worship. Their father, their god of rage, had ascended. They threw themselves into bloodshed with renewed madness. Each cut of their blades a prayer, each scream a hymn. For them, it was glory. For Angron, it was damnation. The tragedy of his life reached its inevitable peak. The only release he ever found was corruption. From that day forth, he was no longer just a Primarch. He was a demon prince, a monster whose very existence was an engine of slaughter. Wherever he walked, the ground cracked and bled. Wherever he roared, men fell to their knees in terror. He became the perfect champion of Khorne, not because he sought it, but because he had been broken into it. The boy who once wept in the pits of Nuceria, who had shown mercy to his dying comrades, who had dreamed of freedom in chains, that boy was gone. Only the demon remained. And yet, even in demonhood, the tragedy was clear. Angron was never freed. The chains had never truly broken. They had only changed shape, iron to gold, gold to brass, flesh to demonhood. His whole life had been slavery, to the riders, to the emperor, to the nails, and now to Khorne. Eternal, endless, inescapable. The galaxy moved on. The Horus heresy ended. The War Master was slain, and Terra still stood. Many of the traitor legions slunk into the eye of terror, broken and bitter, their dreams of empire reduced to whispers in the warp. But Angron did not retreat. He did not brood, nor scheme, nor plot in silence. He was no builder, no strategist, no emperor in exile. He was rage, and rage has no patience for waiting. As a demon prince of Khorne, Angron's existence became an endless war. His form, vast and terrible, strode across battlefields like a living apocalypse. Wings of brass beat against storm-swept skies. His roar drowned artillery, and wherever he landed, the ground split as if the planet itself recoiled. Armies shattered before him. For what hope could mortals, or even Astartes, have against a god's wrath-given flesh? The silence he had once sought from the nails was no longer fleeting. It was eternal, but it came at a price. For though he was freed from the torment of his implants, Angron had merely exchanged one form of slavery for another. The chains were gone, the nails no longer screamed, but corns were coiled around him like iron bands. He fought not for himself, not for his brothers lost on Nuceria, not even for vengeance against the Emperor. He fought because he could do nothing else. He was the blood god's blade, unsheathed forever, and there was no sheath left in existence strong enough to hold him. The Imperium felt the weight of his fury most terribly in the first war for Armageddon. Angron descended upon that world with a host of demons and a frenzied tide of his world eaters, their battle cries shaking the void. For a time, Armageddon itself seemed doomed. Its skies burned crimson, its rivers ran with gore, and the slaughter was so vast it echoed to the warp like a hymn of madness. To stand against Angron was to stand against inevitability. Only the combined might of the Imperium and the Grey Knights, warriors born for demon slaying, could drive him back into the warp. And even then it was no victory, only a reprieve. For Angron could never truly be destroyed. He would return again and again, each time a storm of brass and blood, each time a reminder that some tragedies never end. And what of his sons? The world eaters shattered into war bands, lost in the eye of terror, their cohesion broken, their name cursed. Yet they still carried the nails in their skulls, still bore the torment he had given them. Even in his absence, they fought as he fought, butchered as he butchered, screamed as he screamed. Their father's legacy was not honor, not wisdom, not unity. It was madness. It was rage. It was chains hammered so deeply into the soul that they could never be broken. In this lies the deepest cruelty of Angron's tale. He had once dreamed, however faintly, of freedom. On Nuceria, in the pits in rebellion, he had glimpsed what it might mean to fight and die on his own terms, with comrades at his side. But he had been denied it, by the riders who enslaved him, by the Emperor who stole him, by the nails that screamed in his skull, by Khorne who crowned him in brass. Each chain replaced by another, each betrayal heavier than the last. And so the Primarch who was born screaming still screams across eternity, his roar shaking stars and echoing through the immaterium, never finding silence. The galaxy knows him as a monster. His enemies call him butcher, demon, abomination. His followers call him father, god, avatar wrath. But the truth is more tragic. Angron was never freed. He never escaped. His entire life was a single, endless chain, each link forged in cruelty. The boy who fell into the snow of Nuceria, who showed mercy in the pits, who dreamed of dying with his brothers, that boy died long ago. All that remains is rage. And yet in that rage, there is a terrible reflection. Angron was not simply a failure of fate. He was a mirror of what the Imperium does to all its children. It promises destiny, but delivers chains. It speaks of unity, but demands blood. It crowns its heroes in glory, but buries their souls in torment. Angron was only the loudest scream of truth that echoes across humanity's empire. So when you hear his name, when you picture the demon prince clad in brass, wings outstretched, axes dripping with gore, remember this. He was not born a monster. He was made into one. Piece by piece, lash by lash, chain by chain. He never broke free. He never knew peace. Angron never escaped his torment. He only traded his chain for nails, and his nails for brass. And in the 41st millennium, when the warp rages and the Imperium trembles, somewhere in the madness of eternal war, the Primarch who was born screaming still screams. And he always will.